Welcome to The Backstory. I'm your host, Anne Hancock Toomey. Over the course of my career, I've had the privilege to work with and learn from and guide some incredible leaders, mostly in healthcare, but not always. The Backstory is a chance for me to talk to some of them, unpack who they are and where they came from, and how it all influences who they are today and how they lead. Ultimately, each conversation offers a case study in what I'm calling authentic leadership. Let me now invite you into our conversation for the real backstory. Today, I have the pleasure of spending time with Ken Graboys, the CEO of Chartis, the nation's leading healthcare advisory firm that he co-founded 20 plus years ago. Ken is the consummate healthcare strategist, visionary entrepreneur, and he's kind of my boss. So this should be fun. He's also a great and truly fascinating human. Welcome to the podcast, Ken.
Anne, thanks for having me. When you asked, I was both flattered and humbled, especially given the august guests you've already had. I will try not to let you down, but I make no promises.
You know, I'm really pumped about this conversation. Usually you're the one asking me the questions, but for the next hour, the tables have turned and you're in the hot seat. Ken, just to get us started, I remember the first time you and I really meaningfully sat down. We had both made the pilgrimage to JP Morgan's healthcare conference in January of 2020, I believe it was. And unbeknownst to us, the whole world was about to shut down. But we had lunch together there. Do you remember this?
I do, indeed.
Okay. And I remember that we didn't really talk much about healthcare. We talked about life. We talked about our shared love for Peloton at the time. We talked about how proud we were of the firms that we had built, the teams that we got to work with, and our heart for service. And I felt a kinship with you on that day that has grown deeper in the 5 years since. So I'm delighted at this opportunity. This is obviously a podcast about leadership, specifically how great leaders create an environment that allow people to thrive and to do their best work. And since Jarrard joined Chartis 4 years ago, I've had the privilege of seeing up close and personal your unique and magnetic style, which I think has in part set the tone for long tenured leadership and an industry low attrition rate at Chartis. So you must be doing something right. So if you're ready, we'll dig in.
Let's go.
Okay. I like to always start from the beginning. I know you grew up in a rural area in New England. Tell me a little bit about where you're from and how you grew up.
So I grew up in a small town in Rhode Island, rural town with aspirations of someday becoming a suburb, but it wasn't quite there yet. Grew up with, that TV show Dharma and Greg?
Yeah.
That was kind of like my mom and dad.
Okay.
My dad worked for a local bank, and my mom, kind of an artist and free spirit. And it was a great household of different ideas and philosophies finding their piece together.
Did you grow up with siblings?
Yeah, an older sister and younger brother. My sister ultimately grew up to be a rabbi, and my brother grew up to be the chief of police in Montgomery, Alabama. And I was working in healthcare abroad and here.
My goodness. All from a very small town in Rhode Island.
Yeah, we all shared the ambition of wanting to leave that small town in Rhode Island. That
Fair
was
enough.
about it.
Fair enough. So did you know back in those days what you wanted to be when you grew up?
No, I don't think so. I think looking back, it's always easier to find the through line than when you're living it.
Yeah.
I grew up with this mix of tremendous idealism being imparted to me, at the same time carrying this huge Rhode Island-sized chip on my shoulder. And kind of my growing up was the fusion of these two seemingly diametrically opposed mindsets. I think looking back, it could only have led me to where I am today, but I don't think I realized that at the time.
Okay, so that's an interesting way to describe the environment in which you grew up. Talk a little bit more about the chip on your shoulder.
Well, I think two things were going on at once. One, I was born 6 days after John Kennedy was assassinated.
Huh.
My father was a huge fan of John F. Kennedy's, and he wanted to name me Kennedy. And my mother was like, that's a lot for a kid to have to bear. Mm-hmm. So they compromised, and that's how I got Ken. But just grew up with John F. Kennedy being recited to me day in and day out. For those to whom, much is given, much is required, that type of thing. At the same time, I was a slow processor when I was young, and in this small town, I don't think the school system knew what to do with me. So I was in special ed through 5th grade. Knew that I saw the world in maybe a different way than other people, but I also knew that I wasn't someone who should be sidelined for that. And it really frustrated me. And so I think I just grew up with this chip on my shoulder that I had to show that, yeah, I may think about things differently, but it doesn't mean that I don't have an opportunity to provide value and do things that matter and that can change the course of things. That fuel married to that idealism, I don't think it's a surprise in retrospect that I joined the Peace Corps and kind of went on the path I was going on. But it didn't feel that way at the time. It just felt like this is the right next thing to do.
And you probably felt like you didn't fit in or that you didn't necessarily belong in this place that was supposed to be your home, where we're all supposed to feel safest and most ourselves. Yeah, that's an interesting tension. Tell me a little bit about your first job.
So my first job, I was 5 or 6 years old, and everybody had a garden. I went door to door selling seeds. I would buy seeds from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and then go door to sell them. It was interesting because I learned a really valuable lesson. Because you would go to the door, and there were folks who would immediately say, "Sure, I'll buy a bag of seeds. Here's a nickel or a dime." And then you had folks who would say, "Why don't you tell me about your seeds?" And you clearly were just performing in order to get the dime. And then there were the folks that said, "No, I don't need any seeds." But they were the best, because if you could convince them that they needed the seeds, they would buy a lot of seeds. And even though the hit rate was like 1 out of 4, if you can help someone change their mental model, their mindset, you can actually do a lot with that. That became something I learned really young, and stuck with me.
You learned that at 5 years old? My goodness. What propelled you to want to go door to door selling seeds at the age of 5 or 6? Was this your idea?
In the back of comic books, you could enter into these sales programs as kids, and you could then buy prizes with your proceeds.
Yeah.
So you would send them $1, you would get 20 bags of seeds, you would sell them, and then with whatever you made, you would then buy a bike or something like that. So I saw that, and I thought, that's a good idea, I should do that. But where I lived, you couldn't do it. They didn't service rural Rhode Island. Okay. So then I just decided to do it myself.
Of course you did. I bet your banker father just absolutely loved that.
He got a big kick out of it.
So thinking back, who's the first leader that you can remember who impacted you in a positive way?
I think it would have to be my dad. Just a really strong believer that we have a role to play in uplifting our communities. Yeah. And he did that through the form of lending to farmers and ultimately lending to residents of Providence and of Rhode Island, who many of whom were challenged to find resources. And this is what he did and really believed in. That really stayed with me. I often say to know me is really to know my father, because that's the North Star for me.
Do you remember a specific piece of advice he gave you that's really stuck with you?
There was nothing so terribly quotable or insightful, but his fundamental belief that everything comes down to your values. And everything you do just has to adhere to your values. And the minute you compromise them is the minute you've lost yourself. The lessons are caught, not taught. So it was just watching him day after day doing that.
Yeah. So you left this small community where you were the youngest entrepreneur to ever be in rural Rhode Island with your seed selling door-to-door business. And
I was king, yeah.
And you had sights on something more, something different. You left the small community for the big city for undergrad, headed to Northwestern. Tell me about that choice. What led you there?
I just wanted my college experience to not be more of small town New England. And I think most folks were going to school locally. And the chance to do so and have the urban experience, have a large, diverse student body to interact with was just really exciting to me.
Did you have any idea what you wanted to do at that point? I know you were quite the idealist with the chip on your shoulder. You had some success as a young entrepreneur. Your dad was a banker. You had a heart for service. What'd you want to do?
I wasn't quite sure. I just knew it would be involved in one way or another with community service. But I didn't know in what form or what shape it would take.
So as you think back at those college years, what stands out to you? What experience most shaped you?
I think it was actually leaving college. Yeah, after my second year, while I really enjoyed the experience of being in Chicago and being at Northwestern, it still felt very protected, very structured, and very much part of the ongoing expected rhythm of life. But as you pointed out, I never felt 100% comfortable in. So I decided to go further afield and moved to Alaska and spent about a year out there teaching, working with Native Alaskans on community development projects. And I think that was the first time I really felt most like me. If that makes sense. It was the first time I really felt like this is how I'm supposed to feel. That was a truly formative experience for what came next.
And do you think you felt that way because what you were doing allowed you to contribute in a truly impactful way to those communities? What was it that made you feel like truly yourself?
I think it was that, and it was also being in an environment where there weren't really pre-existing norms that were set that one had to fit into to feel like they were part of the system. Right? They were part of the cultural mores of the time. Like you could create your own environment because we were out in these small villages of a couple hundred people, and it was just you and others, and very few pre-existing constructs that you had to adhere to. And so you can make your own. And I think that's where I learned also, I can build the environment around me that can be the most impactful, be unfettered by kind of pre-existing societal norms.
Yeah, and be authentically who you were meant to be. So did you go from Alaska that year in Alaska back to Northwestern to finish up?
Yeah, I went back and I finished up and then headed to Africa with the Peace Corps.
That's quite a move. Tell me about that decision.
Yeah, no, it's just, I think, more of the same, beginning to carve out where are the environments, where are the contexts where I could have the impact I wanted to have the way I wanted to have it. And that was the opportunity.
So tell me more about Africa. Where were you and what did you do?
Yeah. So I was in Mauritania and Mali, which is the northwest part of the continent, basically the Sahara Desert, part of something called the African Food Systems Initiative. This was back in the mid-'80s during the whole We Are the World thing. And it was the UN was opening a network of feeding centers across the Sahara and looking for volunteers to do that. So I was given a region, 40,000 refugees, and built feeding centers to provide ongoing support to them.
How did you marshal the resources to make that happen?
The resources were not the hard part, right? There was enormous supplies of grain and oil and butter and milk being sent from all over the planet. The challenge was really putting together the logistics network to transport it and then prepare it for the people. And that required dealing with governments of respective countries, respective warlords, local chiefs, and transport organizations, cobbling together an approach to getting the food from A to B and then getting it distributed. So it took about a year to put it all together.
Do you think that was your first real leadership opportunity?
Leadership's such a funny, construct, right? I was giving a talk about a month ago, and so in preparation for that, I looked this up. There are 57,000 books on leadership. I'm sure 57,000 different definitions for what it means. But I guess for me, the degree to which leadership is about orchestrating different talents, different people, different interests, different capabilities to come together to do something great, something bigger than any could do alone. If that's leadership, then I guess that was one of my first opportunities to really try to exercise that muscle. But I'm pretty sure everybody else in that process would not have looked at me as the leader per se. But just somebody tried to coordinate and conduct and get it done.
There's formal leadership and informal leadership. And I think it sounds like you were able to maybe informally get a lot of competing interests and agendas aligned to a pretty
Yeah.
bold vision.
Well, I was very lucky, but it also just makes it clear that we're all just links in a chain. So we would unload these sacks of grain. And this is grain that's traveled tens of thousands of miles. And I got to be the one to unload it and give it out. And that would feel great. Oh my gosh, you're doing this great community service activity. But on every sack, there would be a stamp on it. And the stamp would say something to the effect of provided by the SEIU 211 or the UAW 426. And after a couple months being out there, I asked someone, what are those different stamps about? And it turns out that grain in that sack was supported by a woman working the second shift at the Ford plant in Dearborn. Mm-hmm. And on her paycheck, or W-2, she had an opportunity to check a box that said, please give $1 a week of my pay to African Food Systems Initiative. And so all this food that I had the opportunity to deliver, I was just really that last link in a chain that wouldn't even exist if that woman hadn't checked a box in Dearborn, Michigan. And then if the shipping transport hadn't delivered it in time for it to not have gone to waste.
It's humbling.
Yeah. And all of us are able to do what we do just because we benefit from those before us or those upon whom we depend to have the opportunity we have.
So, Ken, you're in Africa for 4 years, is that right?
Yeah, a little less, but yeah.
Okay. And you come home to the States. What next?
So I took a job working with refugees from Southeast Asia who were resettling in the U.S. And on the board of directors of that organization I was working with was a gentleman named Ira Magaziner. He had a consulting firm, and he went on to go be part of the Clinton White House. But at that time, he had a firm, and he said, what you're doing is important, but you could have a much broader impact if you worked in my consulting firm, because we do international policy and healthcare. And you've lived it. You've done great stuff with the refugees, but why don't you come work at my firm? And he did. And then when he ultimately went to join the Clinton administration, I really enjoyed the work, and I went to a firm called APM, which focused specifically on healthcare in the U.S., and began my work there.
So that is a massive adjustment, going from rural Africa to really corporate life. What was the hardest part of that transition for you?
I don't know that I thought of it that way as being such a enormous leap. I think we all just wind up at that stage in life and later in life trying to figure out what is the nature of impact I want to have and at what level, at what magnitude. Mm-hmm. I was very lucky, whether it was in Alaska or Africa, to really have face-to-face, shoulder-to-shoulder impact on the lives of individuals. From that experience for both of us, the individual, myself, was just life-changing. And I just saw this as an opportunity to move to having broader impact on a slightly greater scale, even if it meant with less intimacy or immediacy of impact. Mm-hmm. But I found that really interesting and compelling from a growth path perspective.
In those early days, what were some of those early projects? Do you remember?
Yeah, my very first project was for this small hospital in rural Indiana that was going to have to close its doors because it just couldn't continue to operate financially. Spent a year there with a small team working with town, county, and state leaders, as well as the hospital and the unions, to try to see if we could rationalize a platform for which it could continue. It was fascinating. It was a great first project just to see how all the different elements of what it means to be part of the American healthcare delivery landscape, how it could work together to create a sustainable provision of access and quality care.
What is it about healthcare that sort of strikes to your core, that fascinates you?
I think it's the fundamental basis of the human condition, right?
Yeah.
When all is said and done and we think about the trauma we've had in our lives, or the moments of devastating sadness, in almost every case, it's because someone we know or we've had to deal with issues relating to our mortality, our health, our existential state of being. And really, healthcare, both for those who are in direct need and the families of those who are supporting those individuals, it just cuts to the core in ways that, other than things like housing security and food security, it just cuts to the core existentially. And so if you're going to spend your life focused on something, it seemed like a good one.
So in your time at APM, was there a leader who really invested in you, influenced you, shaped you, and the kind of leader you've become today?
My dad always did say, if you're lucky in life, you will find a mentor, or a mentor will find you, that you're willing to open yourself up to, be vulnerable with, and learn from, and grow with. And I was lucky that a gentleman named Jim Kagan presented himself to me in my second engagement at APM. He's been a mentor ever since. But he, I think, connected with me, and I don't know if it was out of sympathy or empathy or just he liked to challenge, but he thought he could shape and mold this individual to maybe actually have some real impact. And I learned an enormous amount from him, and I'm quite grateful to this day.
Tell me one or two things specifically that he taught you.
My biggest takeaway from working with Jim is that the most powerful means of interacting with others is through the prism of generosity. And that's generosity of spirit, generosity of interpretation, generosity of self. And that if you do that, it just is the most powerful way to bring out the best in everyone. And if you do it consistently and authentically and not performatively and not in a calculating way, if you do it because you truly can love the work, the people, the outcomes, yourself during it, you can just achieve great things.
And you still talk to Jim?
I still talk to Jim a lot. He actually is the leader of the Chartis Foundation now, which is a wonderful manifestation of the firm, but also of elements of the lessons he taught when we were all young.
Well, you mentioned Chartis. So you were at APM for 10 or so years, did a lot of amazing work there. What led you to leave APM and to begin your own firm?
About 8 years into my tenure at APM was acquired by a large Fortune 100 systems integration company. And the direction of the company and how it thought about success and impact really began to change. And it became pretty clear to me after about 18 months, it was no longer an environment where I felt I could have the greatest impact. And so at the time, Ethan Arnold, who was a dear friend and colleague, we began to talk, hypothesize, what would it look like if we started a firm that did everything the opposite of this? If everything we did was through the prism of impact on healthcare and through the notion that central to all of it is how much we love each other and the work we do in our clients. And if that's what we measure, if those were the stars by which we navigated the firm, what would that feel like? What would that look like? Could that work? We got to a point where we said, we need to try this. We need to try it because it was in our hearts. And we each had 3 young kids, and we wanted to show them that either you could do something like this and it would succeed, and that there is a place in the world to be heart-centered and generous of spirit and mission-driven. Or we would show them that even in a world where that's difficult, you got to try, even if it doesn't work. And we each had 3 young kids, but we took out second mortgages and we started the company. And we were very lucky. About 6 months later, Chris Regan joined, and then a few others after that, and it just kept growing.
I would love to hear your reflections on what was the hardest part of being an entrepreneur and striking out on your own. And maybe it was taking out the second mortgage and the risk that represented for your family. I don't know. But as you think back on those days, what kept you up at night?
In the first year, it was really challenging because we left without any clients. It's not like we spun out of APM CSC, we took clients with us. In fact, we did the opposite. We said we would not talk to or deal with any clients that we've had there because we didn't want there to be any entanglements of any sort. And so for the first several months, we're meeting with different leaders of different organizations and we're explaining this. We're a new kind of firm. We're mission-driven. We're driven around the idea that through authenticity and generosity and passion that we can bring the best and brightest together to do great things together. And I don't think folks knew what to make of us. And so we weren't getting a lot of traction. It was getting a little discouraging. And then we had this one opportunity at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Somehow at the time, the new CEO there was a physician, a guy named Steve Altshuler. Somehow what we said just seemed to strike a chord in him. And while several other much larger, well-established firms were in the running for this particular piece of work, he's like, I like those guys. And we won it. And to this day, I don't know what would have happened to us as a firm if that hadn't happened. But that suddenly gave us a great foundation, a great opportunity, but also the confidence that there are going to be people out there with whom our approach resonates. Since then, we've just been very lucky to keep being able to find folks like that.
I think it's more than luck. So let's fast forward. Chartis is now 23 years old. Looks a lot different than it did in those early days with that first project. First, I would love to hear you, just for the benefit of our listeners, describe Chartis today. And then I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what has made Chartis so enduring over the last 23 years.
Today, we're about 1,000 people. Incredibly fortunate to work with leaders across the healthcare landscape, be they providers or payers or healthcare community organizations, investors, non-traditional healthcare players, working on everything from the most pressing strategic issues to digital and AI technology. We do a lot of work in the clinical domain, on clinical quality and access, a lot of work around affordability and financial performance. We work with managed care and payer organizations. And we've got the shining star of an organization associated with us that is the galactic leader in strategic communications and change management.
Keep talking.
I'm going to turn the tables and put it back on you, because everybody likes to talk about the origin story. And you joined a couple years ago. You had built this exceptional firm at Jarrard that truly does change how your clients in the industry think about what they do, and in changing how they think about it, how they speak about it, and how they actually do it. But somehow we came together. And why? What have you found us to be?
This is my podcast and I do the question asking, but since you're technically my boss, I'll answer your question. We had worked really hard to build a place we were proud of and that people would want to come and stay for a while and to use their talents for good. And we found, I think, a kindred spirit in Chartis. And I think on the other side of the partnership, one of the things that I have appreciated so much is that we have been allowed to be authentically who we are, been allowed to serve our clients in the ways that we need to serve them. And I love this conversation because it sheds so much light on what it is you tried to build and why you built it the way you did. You wanted to build a place, right, that was truly authentic to who you are, but also a place where others could come and share their gifts and their talents in a way that would create real impact. But it didn't have to be exactly your way, right? It could be their way. And so I think that's part of the magic. Okay, back to you. Ken, looking back, what's the accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Okay, the truth, without sounding too corny, is staying married to my wife for the last 35 years. If I were to pick a second mentor, she would be it. She is that ever-present Jiminy Cricket on my shoulder who helps keep me focused and centered on those things that are authentic and important. I think if I ever traveled down a path that began to deviate from that, that would be a problem. And so the fact that she's continued to bear with me through all this and guide and teach and let that translate to our kids has been far and away the greatest accomplishment.
That's a great answer.
It's true. Second would have been the fact that Ethan and I,
your second marriage.
My second marriage, and anything that we're talking about today that has to do with any kind of success at Chartis or even at APM, because we work together there, is really a function of what we both did together. Mm-hmm. It's often been said, most frequently by my wife, that you and Ethan together make the perfect consultant. But without him, I'd just be sitting out somewhere trying to boil the ocean. But he has taught me and complimented me in how to make things real, how to make them practical, how to get them done, and how to move people in powerful ways to be part of it.
David Jarrard always says, to travel fast, go alone. To travel far, go with a companion.
Yeah.
And you've had two really awesome traveling companions.
That is 100% right. I am the lucky beneficiary of each of their skills and their generosity.
Well, let's talk about mistakes. We all make them. And I think the best, most authentic, influential leaders are willing to admit their mistakes, talk about their mistakes, encourage others to take risks and learn from their mistakes. As you think back, is there a mistake that you made in your career that shook you, shaped you, influenced you in some way?
Far too many to count. I had two different thoughts. There was early on when Ethan and I began working together at API, we worked for a very large AMC out on the East Coast on this very large transformation engagement. And it was my first time leading an engagement of that magnitude and Ethan's first time really managing at that level. It became clear to us after about 6 or 7 months that this was going to be a very tough transformation. This organization really didn't really want to change. It said it did and was willing to put forward resources to try, but at its heart, it really didn't, it wasn't ready. But we tried for another 6 months. And then after another 6 months, the CEO called us in and said, it was clear 6 months ago we weren't going to change. Why did you stick around? I gave this answer, which I thought was like this great answer. Like, because we believed if we kept trying, if we worked really hard, if we put our shoulder to the wheel, we could get there. And he said, yeah, but you didn't really think it was going to work, did you? I said, well, we had our doubts. He said, then you should have fired us. You should have walked away. Instead, you kept taking revenue, even though the probability was declining, which ultimately served you more than served us. And I hadn't thought of it that way. And I thought it was a really fair comment. I think since then, we've just always had this orientation that we are not providing value that we can point to every day to the client. We should be talking to the client about it very explicitly and be willing to walk away if the time is not right for them to benefit from all that we're trying to bring to bear. And I would say that probably more than any other mistake has been most formative. But, at a more meta level, when we left our previous organization, Chartis, the founder of APM sat down with me. He said, listen, you're going to go through a lot. You only have to be right 60% of the time. What'll get you is not acting, is not moving. Recently, Roger Federer gave this commencement address at, I think it was at Dartmouth. And he said, I won 80% of my matches in my career, but I only won 54% of my points. And I think that's, to your point, we all make a lot of mistakes all the time. And that's okay. It's what do you learn from them? Are you resilient? Do you get better because of them?
Right.
And do you keep forging ahead against your purpose and the outcome? Mm-hmm. That's been, we forge ahead and we get better every day.
Well said. Can you talk a little bit about your wife, who you've been with since high school?
Yeah, 45 years.
45 years. That's phenomenal. And you guys have 3 boys.
We do.
Who I know you're very proud of. Talk a little bit about your career in the context of your family responsibilities and obligations, as well as all the other dimensions of your life that take up time. How do you balance those? How have you balanced those?
I don't know. I think folks who think they have a lot of advice to give on this front are probably better situated than I am to do so. I don't know that I have anything. I will say the best advice I got was from my wife early on when Chartis was in its nascency. For that first year, and you're wondering, how am I going to make payroll? Am I putting my family at risk? I tried very hard to shield all that from my kids. I tried to shield everyone from it. And she said, you have to let them see you struggle. You have to let them see you fail. You have to let them see your worry, your concern, because if they grow up thinking life isn't hard and life doesn't have setbacks and that anxiety isn't okay or that worrying isn't okay, then the first time they experience that, they're going to be unsettled. They're going to find it disconcerting. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to share everything with them. It turned out to just be so true and so valuable, and the establishment of Chartis, its growth, and all the trials and tribulations that came with it. They had a front row seat. It's really been a family odyssey. But in retrospect, 23 years later, I think they appreciate that there are a lot of ups and downs, and the path, again, has a pretty natural through line looking backwards. But when you're in the middle of it, you can't trivialize the angst, and you can't be put off by it either. Like you have to, move ahead and continue to have faith.
Yeah, and I think so often we fall into the trap of compartmentalization of our lives.
Yeah.
But the truth is we're one person. And somebody gave me similar advice to what your wife gave you about like let your family in, let them see the ups and the downs, and to talk about it and to talk about the challenges you're facing in the work setting and vice versa. Talking about my family life and in my work makes me feel like I'm living a much more authentic and integrated life. And so that is very much been a learning for me in the last few years that I am trying to share with others.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think we're all Lewis and Clark for our kids.
Yeah.
And so letting them see the hardship of the journey is actually part of the gift you give them.
Okay, we've talked a lot about leadership and leaders that you've had the good fortune to have in your life, have been coaches and mentors for you, have shaped you. If you had to boil it down, I know this is a very hard question, but what would you say are the top 3 characteristics of the most effective leaders?
I think the number one thing is to really not like that question. Because if one thinks that they've got the answer of what it means to be a leader, it means that they actually think of themselves as a leader in a way that has form and structure and substance associated with the construct of being a leader. And I think leadership is something that emerges in a moment, in a time, in a context, from a variety of things. And we're all leaders. There's no one who on their gravestone is going to say, I was a great follower. It's not. We're a world of leaders leading lives and journeys, and the narrative for autobiographies from our origin story to what we did with it. And if my role in the workplace is to be a purveyor of an environment in which folks can find and bring their best selves to what we're collectively trying to do, that's what I try to do. And I think for me, my version of leadership is to start with that and to say that, we're all asking ourselves that question, and how do we do it and bring it? Essential to that for everyone is staying true to your purpose and mission and values, having insatiable curiosity, being willing to look at everything through the prism of John F. Kennedy. I grew up with him being quoted to me multiple times every day. But he said, when the centuries of dust have blown through what we know as our communities, as society today, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but as the centuries of dust blow through, what will be remembered for are not our victories and defeats, not our financial success or material gains. Will be remembered for whether or not we elevated the human spirit. So I think, you stay true to your values, curiosity, and not be willing to have your decisions be guided through the prism of, is what I'm doing elevating the human spirit?
See, you got there. You got there. That's 3 amazing characteristics.
I don't know.
What makes you most effective? What's your greatest gift?
I don't know. It's my greatest gift. My greatest good fortune has been to be surrounded by fantastic people. Leadership requires other people, right? It's like, and even if you get
like by definition,
right?
Yep.
So you can't be a great leader, quote unquote, if you've got what else around. Having the opportunity, the benefit, the good fortune of really having found people whose values and curiosity and desired impact all align and have come together in a way that has allowed me to be me.
And finally, is there anything you're working on?
There's this concept in meditation or in Zen philosophy, the beginner's mindset, which is an orientation to bring an open mind, an empty vessel to every discussion, to every challenge, and from a place of learning and curiosity. And I think as one gets older and their cup gets filled with scar tissue and seasoning and experience and all these things that we call wisdom, how do you maintain what I think is invaluable, that curiosity and beginner's mindset with the accumulation and the synthesis of experience and wisdom? I'm working on that.
That's a good one. I need to work on that too.
No, you got time.
All right, kid. This brings us to lightning round. And lightning round is a series of questions and either ors. I want you to just go with your gut. Don't overthink it. You ready?
Gonna try.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Guilty pleasure to unwind from work.
Pizza, bourbon, and family. But it's not a guilty pleasure. It's just a pleasure.
Favorite bourbon?
Jefferson's Ocean.
Oh, it's a good one. It's got a good story.
That's right. The whole
Really
thing.
good one. The whole thing. Favorite holiday? We just came off Thanksgiving. What's your favorite holiday and why?
Well, I'm going to go with Thanksgiving because I was born on Thanksgiving, and it's guilt-free eating and time with family. So,
There you go. Mountains or beach?
mountains.
Last time you tried something new?
Just went snowmobiling for the first time up in the Arctic.
The Arctic. Wow.
Yeah. Awesome.
The book you're reading now?
In My Time of Dying by Sebastian Junger.
Best book on leadership?
Lincoln at Gettysburg, Chapter 3, Transcendental
specific.
Leadership. Yeah.
Okay. I know you spend a lot of time with your family. What's your favorite family activity?
Hiking.
What time do you wake up and how do you start your day?
I wake up around 5:30. We'll read and meditate, and then work out, and then catch up on emails, and then the day starts.
What is one skill that you're working on now?
We came back from a trip to Italy, and I committed to perfecting spaghetti bolognese. And others would say I'm not doing a very good job at it. But it's on the list, working on it.
I'd like to come over for dinner and I'll let you know how you're doing.
Anytime.
Okay, that brings us to the end of Lightning Round with one final question, which is the question that all good reporters ask. Is there anything more you'd like to share?
I would just like to share enormous gratitude to you for doing the Backstory podcast overall. It's been just a really fascinating series to listen to. For having me on it. Thanks for that. And much appreciated.
Thank you for that. I'm grateful to you for your leadership and for your friendship and your partnership. And thanks for taking a chance, rolling the dice, and sharing your story today on the Backstory podcast.
Thank you very much.